too, where it's still light outside. Once again, let's thank the Women's Club for that nice little setup out there. Angela, thank you. And all of the little goodies that you see wrapped up, that's from the St. Joseph's table that the Women's Emmaus put together yesterday. And it was real nice yesterday after the morning masses. So please, on your way out, take all of that. I don't need any more. You know what I mean? So talk about. Well, we're getting kind of down to the end here, guys. We're going to talk about some different vocations, the sacraments of service or vocation today. I'll do a little mini lesson on religious orders in the church, which can be something somewhat shrouded in mystery, even for lifelong Catholics, especially, as you're not necessarily growing up seeing, monks and nuns and all these guys running around all over the place. There might be somewhat of a mystery, and people coming into the church, it's probably a real mystery. Like, who are these people, right? So we'll do that, and then we'll hit the sacrament of holy matrimony to wrap up our sacraments. So let's pray in the name of the Father, the Son, of the Holy Spirit. O ineffable Creator, true source of light and wisdom, origin of all things, be pleased to cast a beam of your radiance upon the darkness of my mind. Take from me the double darkness of sin and ignorance in which I was born. Give me quickness of understanding, a retentive memory, the ability to grasp things correctly and fundamentally, an abundant grace of expression. Order the beginning, direct the progress, and perfect the achievement of my work, you who are true God and true man and who live and reign forever and ever. Amen. Amen. So here we go. So religious orders. Let's talk about what they are and how they work and how they're different from, other people like me. I'm not in a religious order. So how do they fit in with me, with the regular church and all of that? So we might define a religious order as a community of Catholic faithful who live the gospel in accordance with a particular rule or what we call a charism. And it's typically characterized by the principles of its founder. And that usually the founder of the order leaves a permanent mark on them. Members of an order are consecrated to Christ, and they make perpetual vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. Some orders make other particular vows, but all religious orders have these three, and I'll talk more about them as the little mini lesson goes on. Some communities have their origin in the very earliest years of the Christian faith. Those who wanted to kind of separate themselves a little bit and to really focus their lives on prayer and study and work. And other people of even in the 200s, guys like St. Anthony of the Desert, went and lived by himself, and other people kind of wanted to join him, and these were sort of the early years of the first religious orders, just dedicated to prayer, to study, to work, to evangelization, and as we'll see, they expanded into many different ones. The religious order might consist of consecrated laity, meaning brothers and sisters, or clergy, meaning priests, or both. And all members, we might just call them religious, right? And as others belonging to a religious order. Note that religious orders, you'll properly kind of hear them called congregations or societies or institutes of religious life, but we'll just call them religious orders for simplicity's sake. So some common ones. How many are there in the church, by the way? Hundreds of them. I mean, I don't know. I don't think anyone knows. God might know, right? I mean, there's just a lot of them. It's one of the enduring mysteries of the church, how many religious orders there are. There are many of them. Some of them are founded and they kind of peter out. Other ones merge with other ones. But there are some enduring ones that have been around quite a long time. The Order of Preachers being one, the Dominicans, founded back in the 13th century by St. Dominic. The Order of Friars Minor, which is the Franciscans, founded by St. Francis of Assisi, right around the same time, 1209. They just had a few years ago their 800th anniversary. The Order of St. Benedict, or the Benedictines, right? Founded in 529 AD by St. Benedict. Let's see, the Society of Jesus, also called the Jesuits, right? Founded in 1540 by St. Ignatius of Loyola. And the Missionaries of Charity, founded in 1950 by St. Teresa, Mother Teresa of Calcutta. The Order of the Brothers of the Blessed Virgin Mary of Mount Carmel, or for short, the Carmelites, right? Founded in the 12th century AD. So those are some of the more common and well-known ones. There are many others, of course. If you've gone up to Our Lady of Florida, up there in Jupiter, those are run by the Passionists, founded by St. Paul of the Cross, 300 or 400 years ago. So I mean, there are lots of them out there. So when we talk about charisms, it refers to what we would call the distinct spirit that animates the community, gives it its particular character, to the permanent heritage of the order, its rule, its mission, its history, its traditions. In other words, the charism is what they do and kind of how they do it. Now, I'm going to make some very broad generalizations here, and it's probably unfair to paint them this broad, but I'm going to say it in this way. Some orders are more contemplative in their charism, some are more active, right? Doesn't mean one is better than the other, right? They're just, as we'll see, they're not mutually exclusive either. So, for example, active orders, quote unquote, might be engaged in education. You'll see them working in schools or in healthcare and hospitals, or a lot of times you'll see them in parish work or missionary work, serving the poor or spiritual direction or anything like that. Missionaries of Charity, Mother Teresa's group, is an active religious order, but at the same time, like I said, they're not mutually exclusive. They're very much dedicated to prayer, and they will tell you our first duty is prayer. Right? But we express our love for Jesus in this active work of serving the poorest of the poor. On the other sort of end of the spectrum of what we might call the contemplative orders, more engaged in prayer, work, and study, like the Cistercians of the Strict Observance, also called the Trappists, right? An example of contemplative order, much of their day is relegated to silence and to quiet contemplation, but in community, and also some manual labor, right? All of these different things that they do. And I'll give you an example toward the end of this of a typical day in the life of a Trappist community. Pretty interesting. And if you want to sign up, I'll let you know, right? Some of you might want to get away from, for a while and go do this. And actually, a lot of these monasteries, including this one I'm going to show you, they allow anyone in the Benedictine order particularly. One of their things is hospitality, and they virtually all have a guest house where you can go and stay, and you can actually go and pray with the monks during their various hours. You might be in a separate section from them, as they're often kind of closed off, but you can go and eat with them, pray with them, and just kind of be in their little community. It's very nice. I've done that before. So all the charisms are approved by the church. Many of them include active and contemplative elements. They're all dedicated to serving and imitating Christ in a particular way, living the gospel fully according to their calling. And they all enrich the church. The religious orders are seen as very, very valuable in terms of the spiritual patrimony of the church. Not only by their radical embrace of the gospel and the example that they give us, but by the works that they perform for the good of the people everywhere. And I just throw this in here. Don't think that because an order is more contemplative that they're not working. Like you want to tell the monks, hey, quit praying so much and go work like Mother Teresa's sisters, doing stuff. Well, the church actually looks at the contemplative order as a higher calling than the one dedicated to prayer, because you're dedicated to Christ. Right? It's very interesting. I mentioned those vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, common to all of them. They're known formally as the evangelical counsels. These are not necessary to achieve eternal salvation, you'll be happy to know. But they are pursued by those who wish and who are called to it, to go further toward achieving Christian perfection. We might think of them as a radical rejection of the great temptations of the world, the flesh, and the devil, right? You reject the greed of the world by making a vow of poverty. You reject the temptations of the flesh by making a vow of chastity. You reject the disobedience of the devil by embracing obedience, right? All of those things. But I like this way of looking at them better. We'd also think them as a radical embrace of the imitation of Christ, who was poor, he was chaste, and supremely obedient to the Father. Just look at the crucifix, right? So a little vocab for you. Some words, little Catholic vocabulary. You might hear these words and not exactly know what they mean, like an abbey, right? This is basically a name for a monastery or a convent. It might be called an abbey. I stayed in St. John's Abbey up in Collegeville, Minnesota once. It was beautiful. And the abbot or the abbess is the superior of the abbey. Underneath them is a dependent house of an abbey called a priory, and a prior or a prioress is the superior of that. So if you have the big abbey house and then 50 miles down the road, they've got a farm and they have a priory set up. They'll have a prior in charge of that, which some of the guys live in there, Sometimes you hear the word cloister, kind of a double meaning here in this sense. It literally means enclosure, and in this context refers to the area of the monastery that is exclusive to the religious. So you can't go in there. You ever see some of the monasteries or convents, they got the bars, like it looks like they're in jail, and you can kind of go up to the bar. I've done that. You go up and you can talk to the sisters through the bars, but they're kind of cloistered in there, right? And there's sort of this great separation from the world. They're cloistered. They're in the cloister. They're minimal contact with the outside world. Typically contemplative orders, really dedicated to prayer and manual labor without the distractions of the world. Like I said, it might be nice for a little while to go there. Different vocabulary. The word friar, from the old French meaning brother, typically today refers to a male religious, whether a priest or a lay brother, of the Dominican, Franciscan, Augustinian, or Carmelite orders. They are friars. So it's a Dominican friar, a Franciscan friar. That's just the name of them, right? A monk, in typical uses, refers to religious who live in a monastery, such as the Benedictine or Carthusians or Trappists. They are Benedictine monks. So there's no such thing as a Benedictine friar. It's a Benedictine monk, right? Just semantics, but you get the idea. A nun is typically a female religious, usually in a cloistered convent. A postulant or a novice means those who are aspiring to the religious order, who's in formation. So, if Pawanda wanted to join a religious order, he'd be made a postulant first before they kicked him out after a while. And then he's in formation, and then you're an aspirant, you're a postulant for maybe a year, then you're a novice. Every order is a little bit different. You take your vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience for a temporary amount of time, maybe a year or 3 years or something. And then, so usually between, it all depends on the order. You've been 3 to 7 to 9 years of postulancy and novitiate before you make your final permanent vows, your solemn vows.
And have good health, too, right?
I guess you do. I take care. A brother or sister is sort of a term of address to any non-clerical religious, anyone that's not a priest, right? The habit is the religious garb worn by professed members of a religious order. They're often very distinctive to the order. So usually, different ones you can kind of tell right away what order they belong to by what habit they wear. Some of them are kind of generic, but some of them are quite distinct, right? A lot of these people traditionally, upon making their vows, will new brothers or sisters receive a religious name. And it's not as common now, but it's still done. Our friends from the Servants of the Pierced Hearts, Jesus and Mary, that's a local religious order here, they all take religious names when they make their, when they become, when they enter into make their simple vows, they are granted their religious name. And it comes from the biblical tradition. Abram's name was changed to Abraham after his encounter with God, after the formation of the covenant. Jacob was renamed Israel. Simon was renamed Peter, famously, right? Saul became Paul. The idea that after this encounter with the divine, with this new mission that you're given, this change of life, that you change a new name, right? And we kind of carry on that tradition a little bit at your baptism, or more commonly at your confirmation. You take a new name, your confirmation name, right? Representing this turning point in life where you become a new identity as a servant of the Lord. So I was going to say the day in the life of a monk, right? This is Mepkin Alley. This is from their website. This is a Cistercian monastery in South Carolina. So they get up at 3 a.m., right? And so I guess you get 20 minutes there to get ready, throw on your habit, and get down into the chapel. And you spend from 3:20 to 4 doing vigils. It's the office of reading. It's a series of texts that are read aloud from the scriptures and from the church fathers. Then you go into Lectio Divina and private meditation. This would be just a reading of a particular passage of scripture and private silent meditation of this. I mean, at 4 o'clock in the morning, I don't know how they don't, breakfast at 5, then morning prayer, also called lauds, and then mass after. So, I mean, by 7:30, right, you're just hitting snooze, right? They've already been up here and doing all this stuff, Then 8:20 after mass, mid-morning prayer, Church A, or terce as they call it. Then grand silence ends. So, in all this time, you're not talking. There's no talking. I mean, you respond in mass like you would normally, but there's no talking. And even after grand silence ends, there's no, kind of one of the rules, and I don't know how necessarily strict they are, but there's no idle chit chat usually. I mean, it's just you don't just flap your gums all day. It's, if you need to talk, you talk, but otherwise you just kind of, you keep to yourself, right? So there's a morning work period. I forget what these guys do. I think they may have a chicken farm, actually. I forget what they do. But they have a morning work period. And some type of manual labor. Some have farms, some do woodworking, some make vestments. They do some type of labor in order to support themselves in the monastery. And but their prayer comes first. And at 11:30, the bell rings, and boom, you drop whatever you're doing, and you go into midday prayer. Sext, it's not what you think it is. It just means the 6th hour, right? Then lunch, then mid-afternoon prayer, the 9th hour, and then optional rest, which after all that, I would think wouldn't be too optional for me. And then an afternoon work period, and you come back, dinner, then evening prayer, vespers, then night prayer, compline, and then 8 o'clock, you go to bed, right? So there's a day in the life. If you want to sign up, just come let me know. I'll put you in touch with them, right? So I want to make a distinction between religious and diocesan. I mean, we're all on the same team here when it comes to religious life in the church, or clergy, or religious and all this. So religious are members of their order, not of the diocese, right? So as such, a religious might be assigned anywhere in the world where the order has a presence. My dean in seminary was a Dominican friar, and he served all over the world. And he happened to be our dean, academic dean, for a number of years. And then he got sent off to Chicago, and then and they literally call him up, and he's got a little suitcase with his spare habit and a bunch of books, and then he's off. That's the way they do it. They report to their superior, not exactly to the bishop, but you got to have a good relationship with the local bishop if you're in his territory. Many religious priests live and work in parishes, depending on the charism of their order. So there are down at Jesu, downtown Miami, that's staffed by the Jesuits, and so it is a parish of the Archdiocese. Berlin School is run by the Jesuits. So they're here, with the cooperation of the Archbishop, but they are members of the Society of Jesus. Diocesan priests, like me, do not belong to an order. Rather, they belong to a diocese, and they're under the authority of the local bishop. So that's kind of the distinction between them. And there's a particular charism, if you want, of a diocesan priest that works and lives in a parish, right? Whereas a religious might be doing all kinds of stuff all over the world. I was a classmate of mine in seminary, and I think we were in second year of theology, and he discerned to go to the Dominicans because he wanted to do some missionary work. And, that's not necessarily the primary thrust of a diocesan priest. is going out and into the missions and things. I can do that occasionally, and I've done it every now and then. But he wanted to dedicate himself to that. So he left the seminary with us and joined the Dominican order. Last I heard, he was in the Philippines doing some work over there. So.
Father Babbitt was a passionist, wasn't
No. So, questions about religious orders? Yeah. Yeah. Question is about a particular priest. He works at a school. There are, even here in the Archdiocese of Miami, some priests are assigned as chaplains to the high schools or to the college, to like Barry University, or maybe not Barry, or St. Thomas. I guess so. They're usually in residence in a particular parish. They might live at, I don't know if they necessarily live at a high school, not down here anyway, but they live in a community of a parish, a local parish, and they might help out at that parish on the weekends, but their job is to be in the high school every day. So, yeah.
All these religious orders, don't they have to get the blessing from the Pope or somebody? I mean, can I just start an order?
Yes, the question is, does an order need a blessing from the Pope? Yes and no. So to start a religious order, you would at least need the blessing of the local bishop, is usually how it begins. So you'll begin, and usually you'll gather a group of men or women that want to live in community with a certain rule and with a certain charism. You go to the bishop, and hopefully after this time you've already been doing this informally, and you go to the bishop and say, we want to form our own community. Will you allow us? And he will allow it. And then we kind of just see how it goes. And then if it continues to grow, great. And then if at some point they can apply for papal recognition and have and be an order of pontifical right, as they're called, and they're a little bit more established. Usually, the determining factor is after the founder dies, right? You got to see what happens. So the founder is often, someone with a very strong gift and very charismatic and is able to kind of gather these things up. But if it's set up in a way that it can continue after that, I mean, Francis of Assisi, he stopped being master of the order while he was still alive. He gave it to somebody else. And it continued, obviously, 800 years later, it's still going. So some of them tend to kind of peter out. You never know. Yes, Hannah? Question is, would like these monks, when they get up early, would they have an early rosary? That's a good question, and I bet they do. I bet in some of their silent prayer, they're all saying the rosary, either together or by themselves silently, maybe with everybody else, but I bet they do. In fact, a lot of the habits that the religious wear, you'll see them wear this big giant rosary instead of a belt. They're wearing this big old rosary, right? And it's actually like a triple rosary. In its original form, the rosary had 15 decades, and so they'll have that, and they kind of pray that all day. So I guess you take your belt off, and you got your rosary right there. You slap it back on, and I asked. Yes, they do get caught on doorknobs and everything all the time. So So matrimony. Matrimony. Yeah, we did this already. Everyone should try it once. There you go. Every now and then, Eddie, you say something that's all right. All right. So obviously, the institution of marriage has been with mankind since time immemorial. It transcends cultures and religions. Right? The Catholic Church recognizes a spiritual element in the matrimonial bond beyond the simple biological union or a practical partnership, right? And therefore recognize it as a work of God's grace. And this is a natural institution. It's kind of built into our bodies. A man and a woman kind of come together. But beyond that, beyond the biological, beyond the practicality of, you need a man and woman to help raise a family and all of this stuff. Beyond that, there's something spiritual going on. And this is going to be the primary part of the focus today. This is one of the foundational definitions in the law of the church. We're going to be hitting a lot of these little points in here. I'm going to read through it, and we'll be referencing back to this. This is Code of Canon Law, 1055, Section 1, the matrimonial covenant, by which a man and a woman establish between themselves a partnership for the whole of life, is by its nature ordered toward the good of the spouses and the procreation and education of offspring. This covenant between baptized persons has been raised by Christ the Lord to the dignity of a sacrament. So, we'll be coming back to that very comprehensive definition soon. So we said creation. Marriage is established by the Creator and endowed by Him with its own proper laws, built right into our own flesh, as we'll see. Right? Some of the laws were established by the church, no doubt. Others are these foundational laws embedded into our nature. The mutual love between man and woman is an image of the enduring love of God, and this love is blessed by the Creator to become fruitful. That imitation of God, all right, and the man and woman united in Christ points us beyond them to the love of God, to the enduring love of God. We'll talk more about that. Look at these foundational quotes from the book of Genesis, from the creation narratives. It's not good for man to be alone. I will make a helper suited to him. This is why a man leaves his father and mother and clings to his wife, and the two of them become one flesh. Male and female, he created them. God blessed them and said, be fertile and multiply. All of these, become sort of foundational scriptural passages for us in our understanding of what marriage is and also what it is not. So like everything else pertaining to us, the institution of marriage suffered when man fell from God's grace after creation, back when we talked about back in class 3. Too often, marriage becomes marred by the sin of man instead of this beautiful institution created by God. It's a struggle for power and domination, jealousy and lust. In our fallen state, marriage takes on a remedial aspect, and I like this. As the Catechism says, marriage helps us overcome self-absorption and egoism and pursuit of one's own pleasure, and to open oneself to the other, to mutual aid and to self-giving. Remember when we talked about the 7 deadly sins, particularly, how that we said that they were all focused on the self, right? The elevation of the self, the referential, self-referential and exaltation of the self, right? Without regard to God or neighbor. And how to cure that, and that's why Christ said, love of God and love of neighbor is our highest law. The 7 deadly sins are always about caving in on the self. Well, marriage, hopefully, takes on a remedial aspect to the deadly sins. Why? Because now, all right, you got a spouse or you got kids, so you can't be totally focused on yourself. You got to go out toward the other. You can't be caving in on yourself, pursuing your own pleasure. You got to be open to mutual aid, to self-giving. You got to be open to the other, hopefully, right? All right, lessons here. We have newlyweds here. We have them over there. And you're already living it, and then we got these other ones that have been around there for a while, so. Yeah. There you go. The vocation of marriage includes the mutual help of the spouses, both on earth, but more importantly, to eternal salvation. I'm going to hit that again. Right? Now, in the Old Testament, God used the analogy of marriage, get this, to describe His relationship with His people. Right? When you're saying, how does God love His people? How does God care about them? He likened it to the love of a man and wife. Right? And particularly the characteristics of faithfulness and indissolubility in marriage were an analogy of the faithfulness of God to His people and to the unbreakability of the covenant that He formed with them. And in fact, when the people broke the covenant, God described it as being like marital infidelity. The book of Hosea is chock full of that great image, right? And by uniting Himself to human flesh, God the Son, in a sense, weds Himself to humanity by becoming one flesh with it, just like husband and wife become one flesh through the sacrament of matrimony. As we said, Jesus, at His incarnation, weds himself intimately and permanently to our human nature. And by analogy, he says, just like a man and wife wed themselves and become one flesh. Right? The church is called his bride in the book of Revelation. And our heavenly reward with him is called the wedding feast of the Lamb. Right? So all of these things, all of these marital images. You know, when you're trying to find an analogy to describe the love of God for his people and how he sacrifices himself for his people, the closest thing that they could find was a man and wife. Look at that love between them. That's, by analogy, the love of God. Or at least it should be, right? And of course, Jesus' first miracle was performed at a wedding in Cana. And the church has always attached great importance to his presence there. From the Catechism, the church sees in it the confirmation of the goodness of marriage and the proclamation that thenceforth marriage will be an efficacious sign of Christ's presence. I went to Cana on my trip to the Holy Land a couple years ago. And two memories. All the married couples that were there, we did a renewal of their vows. That was kind of cool. And then, and then we had water, with lunch there. And I kept looking at it thinking, is this gonna turn, into, Hey, look at that. All right, look at
How was the wine?
I don't know. I'd love to go back. So there's a deep spiritual connection, right, between Christ's sacrificial love. What do we mean by that? The crucifix, right? His sacrificial love for the church and the love of a man for his wife. Wow, all right? Just as Christ loved humanity, gave himself up for us in humble and total selflessness on the cross, so too are the spouses to imitate the same sacrificial, self-emptying love. I don't mean to say that marriage is like crucifixion, all right? Don't say a word, Carl. Don't say a word. But by analogy, you get that same idea, the same absolute pouring out of himself that Christ demonstrated for us on the cross, out of total love for humanity. That's the image, right, of the love of man and wife for each other. Beautiful, beautiful. That's what Paul meant when he said, "Husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her." So the Christian man and woman united in matrimony are that image of the love that Christ has for his church, sacrificial and fruitful and unbreakable. And it's been the perennial teaching of the church that in his ministry Christ reordered marriage to its original end, which we're going to talk about next, right? And raised it to the dignity of a sacrament of the new law. There's a little PG-13 section coming up. All right. A little excursus here when it comes to, the religious versus the secular view of marriage. And we're surrounded by the secular view of marriage. And that's why people, when they come into the church and they say, the church looks differently at marriage. Sure we do, right? Well, of course we do. And should the church get with the times? Well, no. I mean, remember, the church converted the world from a more humanistic view of relations between man and woman to a more God-centered view of relations in man and woman. And the church didn't change with the times then. The church needs to change the times, not to change with the times, right? What's the marriage, the religious view? Marriage is this. Marriage has been received. The definition, if you will, of marriage, what a marriage is, has been received from God. Okay, and we receive this. Okay, this is what marriage is. We didn't make it up. God gave it to us. This is what he defined as what marriage is, right? So God is the author of marriage. It's not just a human institution. It is a human institution. It transcends all religions, but God is the author of marriage, written into our very flesh. The vocation of marriage, as I said, written into the very nature of man and woman. It's a God-given reality. It has unchangeable essence or nature. We must conform to its terms because we didn't make it up. we receive it from God, who is unchanging. Right? The secular view of marriage is, well, marriage is whatever. Instead of it's this that we receive from God, it's whatever we want it to be, right? It's man-made. It's not God-made. Therefore, it's whatever we want to be. We can change the definition of marriage. Marriage conforms to us. We decide what marriage is, not to be received gratefully from God. And thus marriage can be adulterous, polygamous, polyandrous, homosexual, group, temporary, anything you want, right? You name it, right? The religious view interprets sex and marriage in terms of man. Man is this person created in God's image and likeness. That's what's first. Everything else is interpreted because of man. Personalizes the union of husband and wife in conjugal love. Right? It's between a man and a woman. It's personal. Understands it as the image of the divine and regards it as the human echo of divine love. Just as God unites himself to humanity, so man and woman unite themselves in the conjugal act, right? The secular view interprets man and marriage in terms of sex. Well, that's what we want, and so you can be whatever you want, but we want that first, right? It depersonalizes sex. Just look on the internet, right? It understands sex as the image of the animal, not of the divine. To be more in line with the base instinct of an animal, as opposed to receiving this as an act in accordance with God, ordained by God. It ignores the divine. Sex has little or no meaning in the secular view. So what are the ends of marriage? In other words, marriage exists for two ends or purposes. This is why God created marriage. As we said, this definition, marriage is this. It comes down from God to us. Okay? The two ends, procreation of children and the rearing of a family, and the mutual good of the spouses. That's why marriage exists, right? Those two ends are often called fecundity and fidelity, or sometimes procreative and unitive aspects of marriage. These two things can be distinguished. We can talk about one or the other, but they can't be separated, right? Marriage exists for these two purposes together. And that's very important, as we're going to see. You can't just disregard one and focus on the other. They both come together. Procreation of children and rearing of a family and the mutual good of spouses. Conjugal love requires fidelity by its very nature. It's a consequence of the total gift of self made by the spouses, right? Upon marrying, the spouses make a total gift of self, like we said that Christ does. It's an imitation of Christ. A gift consummated in the conjugal act, right? So I'm giving myself to you when I make the vows, and then later on, you do it physically, right? That's how it works. By this very fact, marriage requires lifelong fidelity. Otherwise, the gift of self was not complete. I give it to you for a while. It's not a complete gift. I give it to you until I get tired of you. It's not a complete gift, right? I'll give it to you until Miss Sweet Young Thing comes along, right? It's not a complete gift, right? And the conjugal act is then robbed of its significance. So through the sacrament, the spouses bear witness to fidelity, giving the marital insolubility a new and deeper meaning. So fidelity is demanded for the good of the children as well, and that makes sense, right? So what about the procreative aspect? Marriage, specifically the conjugal act, is ordered toward procreation by its very nature. It doesn't take a rocket science to figure this out, right? It's just self-evident that that act is designed for the procreation of children, right? That's what it does. And for that reason, the conjugal act is morally appropriate only within marriage. Why? Because it's the consummation of the total gift of self that I made in my vows, right? Along with all the consequences that come of that act. And for this reason, among others, matrimony can only ever be between one man and one woman. And, you know, according to Pope Francis, and he spoke of this a few years back on so-called same-sex unions, there are absolutely no grounds for considering homosexual unions to be in any way similar or even remotely analogous to God's plan for marriage and family. Wow. And yet when you think about it, what he would say is that neither the procreative end or the unitive end of marriage can be achieved through such unions. That's where the church is, right? Also, for this reason, the church cannot condone the purposeful frustrating of the procreative act through artificial contraception or sterilization for the purpose of avoiding contraception, right? It frustrates the very purpose of matrimony and the marital act. That's what the act is for. That's what marriage is for, right? So you can't separate the two, right? It's unitive and procreative. Can't separate them two. So to frustrate that very purpose would be to rob the marital act of its significance. It denies the gift of total self, right? Which defines the marital covenant. And the conjugal act loses significance and risks, as we see very often in the last 60 or so years, becoming an act of selfishness and lust. When I don't have to worry about the consequences, when I separate the procreative act, the procreative aspect from that act, then it can be anything, as we'll talk about here. Once the procreative end is dismissed, other forms of union can also be called marriage. Because now I've taken that, once I take that out of the definition, once I've redefined what marriage is, it has nothing to do with procreation. Now I can redefine, now marriage can be, union can be whatever we want it to be, right? With any type of union can be called a marriage. And once the conjugal act is separated from its procreative end, then other forms of sex, no matter how extreme, become acceptable. More on that later as we get into moral virtues next week. Question? The church does not condone contraception as a purposeful frustrating of the marital act. It does not condone, and I'm not blind to this. All right, I understand the realities out there, but what I would say is this: don't blow off the teaching. They don't understand. Sit with this, struggle with it, pray with it. Let me understand what this does. If we understand what this act means, if we understand what marriage is and what my continual consummation of that gift means, then that taking away some aspect of that definition changes that marital act in a way. How does it? As with everything, with all the commandments, as we said before, the law of the Lord is perfect, it refreshes the soul. The precepts of the Lord are just and all of them right. They are more to be desired than gold and sweeter on the to the tongue than honey, right? In other words, God's laws are received with joy, right? Not, that's too hard. So think of these things. The church doesn't make this stuff up. It's receiving it from the Lord and understanding what marriage is, why God created it, and now sit with it and don't just brush it off as something that I'm not going to worry about that one, right? Yep. What about artificial insemination? Good question. The church has a very dim view on that as well. And I'm not going to get too deep into that today. It's a rather complicated issue. But the basic idea is that we are separating the unitive and procreative aspects of the marital act, right? I mean, it involves a test tube over there in a little room versus, something. And the idea that, and I'm not unsympathetic to those who have difficulties in conceiving. But one of the very sad realities of some of these procedures is that they will artificially create, I don't know how they do it these days, but they'll make 8, 10, 12 embryos in a test tube, right? And then they'll implant, I don't know, a couple of them and see what happens. And hopefully one of them implants. And if they don't, well, they'll go back and get a couple more and try it next month. And then one of them does it, and great. And what happens to the rest of them in the test tube? They'll be there forever, or they're disposed. And under the teaching of the church, those are human beings. They're very small, but they're unique human beings imbued by God with personhood and a soul. And now they're sitting in a freezer somewhere, either to be disposed or to be used for medical experimentation, which again is just, which the church just has a dim view of in the back, yeah.
Father, so would you say that a couple who wants to marry in the Catholic Church, but they have both decided that they do not want children, do you find this out before they say I do?
Yes. The question is, if a couple comes and they both say we do not want children, then you cannot get married in the Catholic Church. Yeah. Yeah. Can you lie to the priest? Sure. But yeah, Eddie, then you, yeah.
Yeah, Father, they were chosen to be barren, okay? You know, God chose
Yeah.
that situation to be that way.
Now, I will bring up another situation. Can an older couple say that they're both widowed and they want to get married, but they're past childbearing age? Can they, and you know, do you have to be, you know, obviously that their children is not a reality. Can they validly marry? Of course, all right? This is biology. This is the way God made us, right? So that's okay. Yeah, question?
And so, if we already have children, then we're all right, right?
You already have children when?
Me and my husband,
You already have children. Yeah.
want to be married in the Catholic Church, so we already have one. We don't have to.
You were saying you have to be open to receiving children as long as God makes you fertile, right? That's the way it is. If you go in and you say, no, we do not want children, and we'll talk about this in a little while, that is an impediment to marriage. You cannot validly marry, even if you lie. You cannot validly marry if you are purposefully excluding the possibility of children. That's one of the central vows that you make before, right before you make your vow. The priest asks both of them, are you resolved to accept children lovingly from the Lord and to bring them up according to the law of God and His church? I do, or I am, right? And you can lie, but you know, you have to. That's one of the vows, right? Going forward, the conjugal act is more than biology, right? We don't look at it in terms of the animal. We look at it in terms of the human. Animals reproduce. Humans procreate, right? Ooh, I like that. Right? There's a partnership with God here in the act of creation of new human beings. Man and woman, through the biological faculties given them by God, provide the egg and the sperm, right? God provides the soul, rendering the new creation a unique person. So, now all of these teachings, everything I've said so far about marriage, the marital act, contraception, all are part of the deposit of faith, the ball, and have been taught since the beginning. It was also taught by all other Christian denominations until very recently, right? Yeah, very recently. And all of them kind of in the last 60, 80 years. The first was the 1930, and then from there, they kind of moved away from those teachings. Let me just mention here, talking about marriage, there's something beyond that, what we call virginity for the sake of the kingdom. Marriage is lofty, of course, and because it is so highly valued by God, the church surrounds it with all these other things. You know, when we, you know, a couple comes to me and, you know, I got to spend 6-9 months getting them ready for marriage, right? And it's not like you can go down to the courthouse and be married in 15 minutes. But it gives you an idea of how important we view marriage by, you know, surrounding it with all these things, making it a little bit more difficult to get there, right? Just make sure you really want it and understand it, right? But the church tradition affirms that there is a higher calling. The bond with Christ takes precedent over all other bonds. And many throughout church history have renounced the marriage bond to, quote, follow the Lamb wherever he goes, right? And here I'm talking about virginity and celibacy for the sake of the kingdom. They've always, since the beginning, been exalted as a great gift of God, given to a person who, in turn, makes a gift of self back to God, right? Christ himself invited men and women to follow him in this way from the Gospel of Matthew. For there are eunuchs who were born that way from their mother's womb, There are eunuchs who were made eunuchs by men, and there are also eunuchs who made themselves eunuchs, figuratively, for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. He was able to accept this, let him accept it. Right?
Father,
Quickly?
how does that, God look at that? You know, you don't want us to, you know, get rid of us.
No.
How does God look at that?
You mean self-mutilation?
Well, to eliminate his problems. No.
No, that would be, no, you can't do that. Self-emasculation, you can't do that. That would be, you gotta battle against these things, not just throw in the towel by cutting it off. You know what I mean? So it does, but doesn't mean it's condoning the purposeful making of them. Right? Now, virginity for this is from Mark, right? Virginity for the sake of the kingdom is a powerful unfolding of baptismal grace. It's a sign which recalls that marriage is a reality only of this present age, in which we shall pass away, and shows forth in the bodies of consecrated virgins the mystical presence of that kingdom to come, where we are neither married nor given in marriage, but are like the angels in heaven. This affirms that marriage is an earthly reality that's in this present age and in heaven. And people ask, will I be married to my husband in heaven? And can I get married if my husband dies? And is that okay? And I go, yeah, you can. The marriage bond ceases with the death of one of the spouses, and that's why someone can marry again consecutively, right? But the way I always tell people, in heaven you're going to love your husband or your wife more than you love them now. You'll be infinitely closer to them then than you are now. How beautiful a thought that is, right? Consecrated virgins participate now in the life to come by their witness that the bond with Christ is supreme over any earthly bond. When you see it, a consecrated virgin, it reminds us, just by their habit, by their presence, there's something even greater than any earthly bond. It's the bond with Christ. Right? And by their lives, they give witness to that. So in the sacrament of matrimony, the way the sacrament is celebrated, the spouses now, as ministers of Christ's grace, mutually confer upon each other the sacrament of matrimony by expressing their free consent, the vows, in other words, before the church. So this is different from all the other sacraments, right? Apart from in that the spouses themselves are the ministers of the sacrament, which is witnessed and blessed, but not conferred by the church. So in other words, the priest does not marry the man and wife, right? Rather, the man and woman marry each other. They are ministers of the sacrament by their mutual self-gift in the vows. Now, I witness it and ratify it by God in my person, right? And then that bond is later consummated by the spouses, right? So that's a very unique aspect of the sacrament. Now, in baptism and confirmation and Holy Eucharist and confession, the priest is the minister of the sacrament, right? In which he's doing the action, and it is kind of, if you will, imposed upon you. Whereas in the sacrament of matrimony, I'm just kind of standing there, right? I'm watching you two give yourselves the sacrament, right? You are the minister of that sacrament. This leads to something which we'll get to in a moment about when it comes to annulments, as we'll talk about, since it's not imposed on you, but the spouses give themselves to each other. Now, when I talk about the consent, the vows, that free consent is vitally important to the validity of the sacrament of matrimony. So what I mean by free is that you're not under any constraint, like a shotgun wedding, right? You're not being impeded by a natural or ecclesiastical law, which I'll talk about. It's given by each of the parties, not just one of them. And this consent is vital. If it's not given, there is no marriage, even if a ceremony took place. Keep going.
Believe what the other person doesn't know.
Well, they when they were saying their vows, they kind of had the thing like this, Yeah. That's why we have witnesses to this, so.
Father, do you think it is a good idea for the couple to write their own vows? How do you personally?
Question is it a good idea for the couple to write their own vows? That's not allowed in the Catholic Church. Yeah, because you got to say it what the vows mean, right? And so you can't make it up. I promise to be, with you as long as I feel like it, and all this other stuff. As long as you do the dishes and do the laundry every night and all this stuff. As long as you don't put the seed down. All right, yeah. Yeah, you can't write your own vows in the Catholic Church, yeah.
Can't have an open marriage.
The renewal of vows. They allow for that. There is a particular liturgy for that. It is different from the actual rite of marriage ceremony.
But you don't write your own vows.
You don't. Yeah, you wouldn't do that either. Yeah, not in a formal blessing. You wouldn't do that. So, so the fact that marriage is a sacrament and an ecclesial reality is why the church requires that the faithful contract marriage under a certain form. Has to be done a certain way, okay? Several reasons. One, it's a liturgical act, therefore it ought to be celebrated in the public liturgy of the church, subject to those liturgical norms. You got to be doing it this certain way. You can't write your own vows. You got to do it this way. Marriage introduces one to an ecclesial order. It creates rights and duties in the church between spouses and their children, so it should be public and done a certain way. And it's a state in life in the church. Certainty about it is necessary, so we have to have witnesses. And the public character of the consent protects the I do, since once it's given, it helps the spouses remain faithful to it. Say, hey, we were all there and we saw you do it, pal, so you better, right? So two things happen, the effects of the sacrament. Like all the sacraments, there are spiritual effects to it. The marriage bond and the graces of the sacrament given. So the bond that arises through the consent of the spouses is sealed by God himself. The marriage bond has been established by God in such a way that a valid and consummated marriage between baptized persons can never be dissolved and remains until the death of one of the spouses. Wow. And it only makes sense once we understand what the marriage is, that total gift of self, right? Okay. Neither the civil government nor even the church has the power to dissolve a properly ratified and consummated bond between the baptized. Notice, it's not that the church will not do it. She cannot do it. She does not have the authority from Christ. Was not given the power by the Lord. As in what God has joined, let no man put asunder. Not that she doesn't want to. The church simply does not have the authority to do it. What's the other effect? Special graces proper to it. The grace of matrimony intended to perfect the couple's love, turn them even more into looking at the other, right, instead of the self, as we talked about, strengthening that indissoluble unity. As Jesus said, and it's so true, he who seeks to save his life will lose it. He who loses his life for my sake will save it. It's that idea that the more selfish you are, the more you're likely to lose the things you want to hold on to. But the more you give it away, including yourself, the more you find yourself. And so it is with marriage. The more you are looking out for the other, the more you're going to get yourself looked after, right? It's just the way it works, right? 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 Okay. By this grace, they would help each other on the path to holiness and the marital life and the education of children. Remember, spouses, among the purposes of the matrimony is the mutual help to salvation. You are supposed to help your spouse get to heaven. It's harder for some of you than others, but that's one of your duties, right? Well, hang on to that one. So, all right. Obviously, I'm setting up the way that things should be. There's the way that things sadly are. From the Catechism, and I quoted this directly. Yet there are some situations in which living together becomes practically impossible for a variety of reasons. In such cases, the Church permits the physical separation of the couple and their living apart. However, the spouses do not cease to be husband and wife before God, and they are not free to contract a new union. In this difficult situation, the best solution would be, if possible, reconciliation. The Christian community is called to help these persons live out their situation in a Christian manner and in fidelity to their marriage bond, which remains indissoluble. That's it's tough, right? It is tough. Now, there are obvious cases in which separation is acceptable and even warranted. You can think of any number of them. And these are some of the more difficult things that we deal with. There are certain realities that happen. And of course, divorce. Divorce refers to the dissolution of the marriage bond, and as such, it's impossible. A valid, sacramental, consummated marriage can never be dissolved except by the death of one of the spouses. The church follows the teachings of Jesus. What else can we do? Whoever divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery against her. If she divorces her husband and marries another, she commits adultery. Matthew, Mark, Luke, Romans, and such. Right? It's part of the deposit of faith handed down to us from Christ through the apostles, and the church has to remain faithful to his teachings. What else can we do? Right? But obviously, there are many Catholics who have had recourse to civil divorce. In fidelity to the teachings of Christ, the church maintains that a new union cannot be recognized as valid if the first marriage was valid. If the first marriage was valid. Okay? Come back to that. Note that the death of one of the spouses frees the remaining spouse to validly remarry in the church. You can receive the sacrament of matrimony more than once, just not at the same time. Consecutive, but not concurrent, right? Good question. And of course, you would be the one to come up with that. Can you kill your prior spouse? Believe it or not, John, there is a law written into the church that, because the theory goes, all right, if you kill the spouse of the one you want to marry, then she is now free to marry me, right? Makes great sense, all right? However, there's church law written specifically in this case. The church has been around a long time. It's seen a bunch of stuff. It says, yeah, it's an impediment. It's called the impediment of crime. And so if you kill the spouse of someone that you want to marry, you cannot validly marry that remaining spouse. Yeah, isn't that something? Nice try. Nice try. So, if the divorced are remarried civilly, they find themselves in a situation that objectively contravenes God's law. And consequently, they typically cannot receive the sacraments, including Holy Eucharist and confession, as long as that situation persists. They can receive reconciliation through the sacrament of penance, but can be granted only to those who have repented for violating the sign of the covenant and of fidelity to Christ, and who are committed to living and complete continence as brother and sister. So there are many situations you say, there's no way I could do that, but many, many, many do. Yeah. Please note, we do make a distinction between being divorced and civilly remarried. Okay? Quickly.
Yeah, if you're supposed to go through the priest before you live with somebody as brother and sister, right? Is that right?
Well,
Is that what? Because I wasn't aware of that.
I mean, you should be doing it anyway. You don't need my permission to do it, I guess, is what I would say. Let me make so the state of being civilly divorced and single does not necessarily mean one cannot receive communion. The divorced and remarried are not excommunicated. They remain a part of the church, even if they are unable to fully participate in the sacraments. That's very, very, very important. Many people are harmed by that thought. I had a lady a few years ago. She was divorced 30 years ago. And someone told her she was excommunicated. She stayed away from the church for 3 decades. She happened to come once, and she talked to me once, and she says, well, I'm excommunicated. I said, who told you that? I mean, she goes, well, I had a friend that told me that. I'm like, no, you're not excommunicated. You spent 3 decades away from the church because someone told you something, right? So, you are not excommunicated, if you are divorced or even remarried, right? So, civil marriages. Let's talk about those real quick. So, civil marriage is a situation when the state declares that a man and woman are husband and wife, therefore, thereby claiming thereby to make them as such. Now, the state has no power to do this under church law, for Catholics, right? With regards to the baptized. Its only job is to register such marriages once they have taken place. Now, Catholics, like everybody else, are bound to have their marriages civilly registered, but the state of marriage does not arise from the civil law when it comes to the church, right? Civil marriages are typically not recognized by the church if one or both of the parties are Catholic, because they did not follow the proper form. And they go, well, wait a second. Usually, by the way, these are very easily corrected in the church. I do these all the time. A young couple, when they're in college, they go off to the beach or to Las Vegas and they get married, and hey, they're still married 20 years later, right? But they recognize, we really need to get the sacrament of matrimony. And so they come in, they've already been civilly married and with kids and everything else, and we do what we call a convalidation. We have them receive the sacrament of matrimony. It's the same exact ceremony, if you will, the rite and everything, as I did for you guys, without all the big pomp and circumstances like you guys had, all that other stuff. And but I do those all the time. Let me mention this, that imagine, Harold and Lauren here are going to get married. And they go down to the beach one day at sunrise, and they profess by themselves, they profess their undying love to one another. And they consider themselves at that moment married, right? How beautiful. It was beautiful. It was a sunrise. It was beautiful, beautiful breeze, everything else, beautiful. You go down and whatever you're doing next, and you say, well, we're married. And you go down to the courthouse. Well, we're already married. And the state of Florida goes, no, you're not. You didn't follow the proper form. You got to go down to the courthouse. You got to get the license. You got to pay the $35 or whatever it is. You got to get in front of a judge, and the judge marries you, right? That's the proper form to get married under the state. And you go, well, okay. Church is the same way. To get married validly in the church, it typically has to be in front of the priest in the church according to the form with the vows that we give, right? And if you say, well, we went down to the beach and did whatever at the courthouse, fine. But to be married according to the law of the church, you have to do it a certain way, in the same way that this county makes you get married according to their way. That's how we might recognize those two differences. That said, the church will generally recognize as valid the marriage in any form of non-Catholic or non-Christian men and women. Only Catholics are bound by church law. So, if a Hindu and a Shinto go to an Elvis impersonator in Las Vegas at a drive-through chapel and get married, we will see that not as a sacramental marriage, right? Sacraments are only between the baptized. But we will see that as a natural and valid marriage, right? You can do whatever you want if you're not within the church. But if you're in the church, you got to do it this way, right? If you're outside the church, we'll recognize it as valid, sure, all you want, right? So, quick question there, Bob?
Yeah, if two baptized Catholic people get married at the courthouse, whatever, legal city, county marriage, and not in the church, though, are they actually committing sin?
Question is, if two baptized Catholics who go down to the courthouse and get married, or they are in an irregular situation, put it that way. If they understand the sinfulness of it, I don't know, which is a requirement to understand that they need to do that, but they are in an irregular situation, which I'm happy to regularize. All right, so what about annulments? All right, and we'll come to the end with this. What about annulments? You hear about annulments all the time. Annulment is more appropriately called a declaration of nullity, and I'll tell you why. It states that a union that was reputed to be a marriage has proven not to be so under closer examination. Well, there's a declaration that the union is null. meaning that no marriage ever existed, even though there was a ceremony. So, yeah, I was there. It was a beautiful ceremony. The bride looked radiant, and the cake was good, right? But despite all that, there was no sacrament. A bond was not created for some reason, as we'll see. In other words, the church does not and cannot annul a marriage, cannot dissolve a valid marriage, but it can declare that a purported marriage never existed in the first place. Okay, see that? Now, whether a marriage is declared null or not has solely to do with the circumstances leading up to and at the time of the marriage. So nothing that happens afterwards necessarily affects the nullity of the marriage unless it's pointing back to something on the marriage, for the marriage. Let me get into this a little more. Nullity is declared when it can be demonstrated that the marriage was not or could not be contracted because of some impediment. There was something blocking the free consent, which was so important, of one or both of the parties, thereby preventing the marriage bond, even though there was a ceremony. Now, this process is handled first at the parish and then through what we call the Diocesan Marriage Tribunal, which sounds very ominous, but it's just a bunch of priests who are trained in canon law, and they're all very nice. And they're empowered to undertake these investigations and to make a determination as to the validity of the marriage in question. They are canon lawyers, as they're called. This is not Catholic divorce, right? I hate when people say that, right? But divorce dissolves an existing union. We don't do that, right? Right. Now, let me give you an idea of grounds, right? When we have this lack or flaw in that free consent. So there's no commitment to exclusivity, right? So when you say I do to your wife, you're saying I don't to every other woman, right? So, you know, and I've seen a bunch of stuff, right? You know, you had something going on the side there during the engagements, and, you know, even on the honeymoon, and even, and it was, and you can demonstrate this, and you can say, well, he said the words, but he didn't mean them, right? He wasn't prepared. He didn't understand that, okay, I'm really supposed to do this. He did, you know, whatever it was, right? There was no commitment to exclusivity. There was no commitment to a lifelong union. Well, we'll get married. We'll see if it works out. If it doesn't, we'll get divorced. Can't do that, right? You got to going in, this is for life. You say those words. If you can demonstrate to a level of moral certainty, this isn't a court of law, but to a level of moral certainty that they had no intention of maintaining that lifelong union, come what may, better for worse, richer for poorer, all that stuff, then you didn't make the commitment. You didn't make the bond. It never happened. No desire for children, if that can be demonstrated. Conditional consent, this is my favorite, you know, where you know, I will marry you, and the idea is that, well, because you're going to inherit millions of dollars from your grandma when she kicks the bucket, all right? So you get married, and you're thinking, yeah, all right, and then grandma writes you out of the will, and you go, well, I don't want to be married to you now. I married you with the condition that you would inherit all these millions of dollars. And so now I don't want to be married. So in other words, it was a conditional consent. Can't do that. Cannot have any conditions when you marry someone, right? You got that? Uh-oh. Harold's looking at his wife there. Uh-oh. Yeah. Yeah. You know, all right. So you marry your husband when he's in medical school. You're thinking, all right. You get married, he flunks out. And then you go, hey, I wanted to marry a doctor. You put a condition on the marriage. Not saying that you had an idea of what, you know, but you put a condition in your mind on the marriage. You can't do that in a Catholic marriage. And if you do, you do not give yourself. You're giving yourself conditionally, which you can't do, right? Christ did not give himself conditionally to us. We cannot give ourselves conditionally to our spouse. So if you do, and it can be proven, the bond never happened, right? lack of form, canonical form. If you go down to the beach, you go down to the courthouse and you're Catholics, that is a lack of form. You did not do it according, you made up your own vows, right? You can't do that, right? You have to do it according to the law of the church. Violence or fear or some other lack of freedom. So you're dating somebody and oopsie, she gets pregnant. And the girl's dad says, boy, you better marry my daughter or else, right? And you go, ugh. And so you get married. Were you free? No. Was your freedom impaired? Yeah. Or, oopsie, there's a baby coming. We should get married and, try to do the right thing and all that. That's wonderful and everything. But would you have married otherwise? The answer is no way. But you did. In other words, you were not acting freely. If this can be proven, then the bond never happened. Right? You have to give a free act, right, in order for the bond to happen. So there are many other such typical grounds, right? Once those grounds are proven to a certain level of moral certainty, then a declaration of nullity is issued. And when that's declared, it's a legal term. It says something about the state of the marriage. Doesn't say anything about the relationship or between the two parties, whether they loved each other or not. Right? Doesn't make any statement about the legal status of children. Children are not considered illegitimate from a marriage that was declared null. It's a declaration that no marriage ever took place, even though there was a ceremony. It's not the same as a divorce, which claims to dissolve an existing marriage. And once that nullity is obtained, the party is free to marry in the church. Now listen, talk to a priest. I've painted some very broad strokes here because I kind of have to. There are 3 courses in seminary, a year and a half to go through all this. I boiled it down to about 10 minutes, okay? There's a lot going on here. If you have some doubt or question about your marital status, if you think you might need an annulment, if you're not married in the church and you would like to be, talk to a priest. I get these questions all the time, right? And please be careful making assumptions or giving advice about marriage and annulment issues. Like that poor lady who was 30 years, because someone told her, hey, you're excommunicated, you can't go back to the church. And look, 30 years later, she's all upset that happened. And I'm like, no, come on, you can come on back to the church, right? So just refer them, hey, listen, go talk to Zerilli, right? And or Father Babin the Merciful, right? All right. Next week, the final class. Hey, all right. Don't all cheer at once. All right, yeah. Your term is almost up. Purgatory is almost over. So next Monday, next class Monday. It's just corrected from the handout. I'm sorry about that. I made a mistake in the handout. Next class, March 28th. Next Monday. We'll talk about the moral virtues in Christian discipleship. Remember, catechumens and non-baptized on the big day, Easter Vigil, April 16th, Saturday night at 8 p.m. We're going to do your rehearsal on that same day at 10 in the morning. Everyone else, Easter Sunday at 9:30. Your rehearsal will be on Saturday just after the catechumens, okay? And we're going to have confessions available to you right after that rehearsal. So you can go another time if you want, but I want all of those being received, anyone that's going to be getting their sacraments on Easter Sunday, I'd like you to make a point of going to confession. I will make them available to you on that Saturday after our rehearsal. You don't have to go to me if you don't want to. I'll have Father Martin there and Father Babin the Merciful. He will be there, all right? So, well, all those for communion and confirmation, there's about 20. About 20. Yeah. Sure.
Fasting on Friday. Is that all, like you don't eat anything? I tried to Google this, but I'd rather talk to a priest.
Question is fasting on Friday. Well, there's no fasting per se on Friday. Good Friday, yes. Good Friday is a day of fasting. It's a very mild fast.
Oh, so you, okay.
It's a very mild fast. The rule is, basically two little meals and one normal meal. All right, no snacks and no meat. So it's a day of abstinence and fasting. It's so minor as to be laughable, but just it's not like like I said, some other faiths that do fasting, they do serious. Sun up to sundown. Not even water, right? So yeah. So I'll see you next week for the last class, and we'll have a bunch of goodies there for you, for all of the RCIA people, on courtesy of the Women's Club. Glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit, as it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without end. Amen. Thank you so much.